I parked across the street with the engine still running, my fingers gripping a stack of ivory wedding invitations so tightly the edges bent against my palm. Robert's careful handwriting stared back at me from the top envelope. Neat. Deliberate. Confident. The address was supposed to belong to his parents. The people I would soon call family. The people who had been living abroad for years. Too fragile to travel. Too private to call. But there was no quiet home waiting for me. No porch. No flower beds. No mailbox with a family name. Instead, a tall gray building loomed across the street. Cold and official, a metal plaque near the entrance reflected the late afternoon light. I leaned forward in my seat, squinting until the words came into focus. County Probate Court Annex. My stomach tightened so suddenly it felt like something inside me had dropped. I blinked hard, telling myself I must have copied the address wrong. I pulled the envelope closer, reading the numbers again. Then again. Same street. Same number. People moved in and out of the glass doors carrying thick folders. Their faces tired and distracted. No laughter. No children. No sign of family life anywhere. Why would my fiancé list a courthouse as his parents' address? That was the moment I realized something about Robert's story had never been true. Earlier that morning, everything had felt simple, safe, predictable in the quiet way life becomes after enough years alone. I sat at my kitchen table, sunlight pouring across the worn oak surface, carefully organizing stacks of invitations beside my coffee mug. The smell of fresh paper mixed with the faint scent of lavender from the candle I kept burning near the window. Planning a wedding at 58 wasn't something I had imagined for myself. Not after losing my husband nearly 10 years earlier. Not after the long stretch of evenings spent alone, convincing myself that independence was safer than hope. But Robert had changed that. Or at least, I believed he had. I picked up another envelope, smoothing my hand across its surface before sliding the invitation inside. My handwriting, once steady, trembled just slightly when I reached the line addressed to Robert's parents. I paused, staring at their names, Harold and Margaret Hale, written in Robert's familiar script on my guest list. I had never spoken to them. Not once. Not on the phone. Not over video. Not even through a brief holiday greeting. Whenever I asked, Robert always gave the same explanation with an easy smile. They prefer privacy. He'd told me months ago during dinner. European life is quieter. They like their space. At the time, I accepted that answer without hesitation. Privacy felt reasonable, respectful. Even now, sitting alone at my kitchen table, the thought pressed against my mind in a way it never had before. Why hadn't I insisted on meeting them? I tapped the pen lightly against the paper, hesitating. I could mail the invitation like the others. Drop it into the post office box and never think twice. But something inside me resisted that idea. A small, quiet voice, not loud enough to call fear, but strong enough to cause doubt. Robert had always changed the subject when I asked about his parents. I remembered one evening clearly. We had been sitting in a softly lit restaurant, music playing low in the background. I had asked casually what his mother liked. Flowers. Chocolates. Anything I could include with the invitation. He laughed too quickly. "Oh, she's simple," he said. "Doesn't care much about gifts." Then he reached for my hand and began talking about honeymoon destinations, steering the conversation somewhere brighter, lighter, easier. At the time, I told myself he was just distracted. Now, the memory sat differently, unsettling. I placed the pen down and stared again at the address. A strange thought formed, one that felt both unnecessary and unavoidable. What if I delivered this one by hand? It would be thoughtful, personal, the kind of gesture that future in-laws might appreciate. At least, that's what I told myself when I reached for my car keys. The drive across town felt ordinary at first. Familiar streets gave way to busier intersections, and then gradually to blocks I didn't recognize. Traffic lights blinked from green to red as if guiding me forward without explanation. But something shifted as I continued. The houses disappeared. Tree-lined sidewalks gave way to tall office buildings. Government signs appeared at corners. Parking lots replaced driveways. The rhythm of residential life faded into something colder and more official. I slowed at a stoplight and glanced down at the paper again. The address still matched. Still correct. Still wrong. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. Why would elderly parents live in this part of town? The question followed me all the way to the curb where I finally pulled over. I left the engine running longer than necessary, staring at the building in front of me as if it might transform into something familiar if I waited long enough. It didn't. The gray structure rose above me without warmth or decoration. Glass doors reflected the late afternoon sun, making it difficult to see inside. People entered and exited in quiet succession, clutching folders against their chests. No curtains, no flowers, no family life. For a moment, I considered driving away, pretending I had made a mistake, pretending nothing about this felt strange. But curiosity pressed harder than fear. I turned off the engine and stepped out of the car. The air smelled faintly of asphalt and paper dust. My footsteps echoed against the concrete as I approached the entrance. Inside, the air changed immediately, cool, sterile, carrying the sharp scent of disinfectant and old files. Clerks sat behind long counters. Rows of forms lined the walls. Voices murmured quietly across the room, blending into a low, constant hum. I moved slowly, pretending confidence I didn't feel. Then I saw it. A large directory board mounted against the far wall. My eyes scanned the rows of departments until one word caught my attention and refused to let go. Guardianship. A strange chill moved down my spine. I didn't know why that word unsettled me so deeply. But it did. I stepped closer, drawn forward by something I couldn't explain. A public filing board stood beside the directory, covered with neatly typed names arranged in narrow columns. I leaned in, scanning, searching without knowing what I expected to find. And then I saw it. Robert Hale. His name appeared in black letters, typed neatly among dozens of others. My breath caught so sharply it hurt. Not once, more than once. The name repeated across multiple lines. I stared, hoping I had mistaken it, hoping it belonged to another man with the same name. But deep down, I already knew the truth. Then my eyes moved to the line beneath his. Another name. Evelyn Carter. Something about it tugged at my memory. Faint but persistent. I leaned closer, narrowing my eyes as if the letters themselves might explain what my mind could not yet grasp. Evelyn Carter. The name stirred something distant, a memory just out of reach. A face I had seen somewhere before. Slowly, painfully, recognition began to form. She wasn't a stranger. She was someone I had seen before. Someone from church. Someone who had once stood beside Robert in the fellowship hall, smiling politely, carrying a casserole dish like so many of us did, and someone who had quietly disappeared months ago without explanation. My heart pounded harder as I shifted my gaze upward, reading the category printed above both names. Guardianship petition filed. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't about meeting his parents anymore. It was about uncovering something far darker than I had ever expected. I stood frozen in front of the filing board. My eyes locked on the words printed above the names. Guardianship petition filed. The phrase sat there in plain black letters, simple and official, yet heavy with something I didn't fully understand. I wasn't a lawyer. I didn't know every legal term. But I knew enough about life to recognize when a word carried weight. Guardianship meant control, authority, the right to make decisions for someone else. And Robert's name sat right beside another woman's, Evelyn Carter. My chest tightened until it felt difficult to breathe. I kept staring at the board, willing myself to believe there was some harmless explanation. Maybe it was volunteer work. Maybe legal paperwork for someone elderly who had no family. But deep down, something colder was forming, a quiet dread that refused to loosen its grip. I stepped backward slowly, my heels scraping lightly against the polished floor. Around me, clerks shuffled papers and answered phones as if nothing unusual had happened. People walked past holding thick folders, their conversations soft and routine. The world continued normally. But inside me, nothing felt normal anymore. For a moment, I considered walking to the counter and asking questions. The words formed in my throat, ready to escape. "Excuse me, can you tell me why this name is listed?" But fear held me still. What if asking drew attention? What if someone mentioned my visit later? What if Robert somehow found out I had been here? The thought made my pulse jump. Without another word, I turned and walked quickly toward the exit. The glass doors slid open with a quiet hiss, and warm air rushed against my face. I didn't stop until I reached my car. Once inside, I shut the door harder than necessary. The sound echoed inside the small space, startling me. My hands trembled slightly as I gripped the steering wheel. The quiet hum of the engine felt too loud, too sharp against the silence inside my chest. Evelyn Carter. The name wouldn't leave my mind. I closed my eyes for a second, letting memory rise on its own. And then it came. A church fellowship dinner from months ago. The smell of baked casseroles and fresh coffee. Soft laughter filling the room. I remembered standing beside the long buffet table when Robert waved me over. "There's someone I want you to meet," he had said. That was the first time I saw Evelyn. She stood beside him, holding a glass dish wrapped in foil. Her smile had been polite but cautious, the kind people use when they are trying to appear comfortable in unfamiliar company. She wore a pale blue sweater, and her hair had been pulled back neatly, revealing a soft, tired face. We spoke briefly that evening. Nothing deep, just polite conversation about church events and volunteer schedules. And then, not long after, she disappeared. No farewell announcement, no goodbye luncheon, no explanation. At the time, I had assumed she moved closer to family or relocated for health reasons. People leave quietly all the time. But now, sitting alone in my car outside that courthouse building, the memory settled differently. Uneasy. Wrong. I opened my eyes and reached for my phone, scrolling through old messages and church announcements, hoping to find some mention of Evelyn leaving town. There was nothing, not a single word. The absence itself felt louder than any explanation. Later that afternoon, I drove toward church under the excuse of dropping off paperwork for the volunteer committee. The familiar parking lot came into view, its wide open space lined with cars belonging to people I had known for years. Normally, stepping into church brought comfort. Today, it brought tension. I pushed open the heavy doors and stepped inside, forcing my shoulders to relax as I greeted the few people gathered near the entrance. Their smiles felt warm, but something beneath the surface seemed different, or maybe it was just me who had changed. I spotted Linda near the coffee station, arranging cups into neat rows. "Afternoon," I said casually. She looked up with her usual friendly expression. "Maggie, good to see you." I poured myself a cup of coffee, pretending calm while my heart beat steadily against my ribs. Then, as naturally as I could manage, I asked, "Have you heard from Evelyn Carter lately?" Linda's hand froze mid-motion, just for a second, but long enough for me to notice. Her smile returned quickly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, Evelyn," she said slowly. She moved away a while back. Moved away. The words sounded rehearsed, like something repeated too many times. "Did she say where?" I asked gently. Linda shook her head. "No, it all happened pretty fast." Behind her, another woman glanced in our direction before quickly looking away. Someone else shifted uncomfortably, pretending to focus on a stack of bulletins. The air around me felt heavier. Then Linda leaned slightly closer, lowering her voice. "Robert helped her through the process," she added. "Handled most of the arrangements." The words settled into my chest like cold stones. Robert helped her. Handled arrangements. I nodded slowly, pretending the information meant nothing. Pretending the unease spreading through my body was only curiosity. But as I left the building and walked back to my car, my thoughts moved faster than I could control. That evening, the house felt too quiet. The kitchen lights cast long shadows across the floor as I opened my laptop and typed Evelyn Carter's name into the search bar. The glow of the screen illuminated the room, turning everything beyond it into darkness. At first, nothing appeared, just scattered results, old listings, church bulletins. Then, buried several pages deep, I found a short local article from months ago. The headline read, "Local woman relocates after legal transition." Legal transition. The phrase made my pulse quicken. I clicked the link and leaned closer to the screen, reading every word slowly. The article was brief, almost vague. It mentioned Evelyn relocating to another state under legal supervision, with assistance from a private caregiver. Further down, a line caught my attention. Guardianship support services were involved in the relocation. Guardianship. The same word I had seen on that courthouse board. My stomach tightened. Why would an independent woman need guardianship? Why would Robert be involved? The front door opened suddenly behind me, and I jumped slightly in my seat. "Mom?" Claire's voice carried across the kitchen. I turned to see her stepping inside, her coat draped over one arm, her expression curious but alert. "I thought I'd stop by," she said, setting her bag down on the counter. "You sounded strange on the phone earlier." I closed the laptop slowly, unsure where to begin. "We were talking about wedding plans," she continued casually. "Did Robert finalize the prenup yet?" The word hit me harder than expected. "Prenup." I hesitated, then reached into the drawer beside me and pulled out the folded stack of papers Robert had given me earlier that week. "I haven't signed it," I said quietly. "But he wants it done soon." Claire took the papers from my hand and unfolded them carefully, her eyes scanning the text line by line. At first, her expression remained neutral. Then her brow tightened. She stopped reading and looked up at me, her face suddenly serious. "Mom, did you read this carefully?" A chill spread through my chest. "Not every line," I admitted. I stopped myself before finishing the sentence. Claire lowered her gaze back to the page, tracing one paragraph with her finger, her lips pressed into a thin line. "This wording," she said slowly, "isn't normal." She turned the paper toward me and pointed to a section buried halfway down the page. I leaned closer, reading the legal language that suddenly felt heavier than before. Temporary authority during periods of incapacity. The words blurred slightly as my pulse quickened. Claire exhaled slowly. "If this document does what I think it does," she said carefully. She lifted her eyes to meet mine. "Then signing it could give Robert control over everything you own." Claire sat across from me at the kitchen table, the stack of papers spread between us like something dangerous we had accidentally uncovered. Her finger traced slowly along a paragraph. Her lips pressed into a tight line. The soft hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, louder than it had ever seemed before. "Mom, this isn't a standard prenup," she said quietly. The words settled into my chest like a weight. Prenups weren't supposed to feel threatening. They were supposed to protect both people, practical, responsible, fair. That's what Robert had told me when he first handed me the document with his reassuring smile. "This is just smart planning," he had said. "It protects us both." Now, watching Claire's expression tighten, I felt something cold spread through my stomach. "What do you mean it's not standard?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Claire turned the document toward me, her finger pressing against a highlighted sentence buried halfway down the page. The legal language blurred together at first, dense, formal, confusing, but one phrase stood out clearly: temporary authority provision. I leaned closer, forcing myself to read slowly. The clause explained that under certain conditions, illness, injury, or temporary incapacity, Robert could request authority to manage my finances and legal decisions. My breath caught. "Incapacity," I whispered. Claire nodded grimly. "The problem isn't just the clause," she said. "It's how vague it is." She tapped the page again. "There's no clear definition here. No strict requirements. It leaves room for interpretation." Interpretation. The word echoed in my mind. How easy would it be? I asked quietly. For someone to claim I was unfit to manage things. Claire didn't answer immediately. Instead, she leaned back slightly, studying the document as if it were something alive. Too easy, she said finally. The kitchen felt colder, even though the lights were still warm and steady. I wrapped my arms around myself without thinking, trying to push away the chill creeping into my bones. Did Robert ever talk about guardianship? Claire asked suddenly. The word struck me like a sudden flash of lightning. Guardianship. I saw it again, printed on that courthouse board. Robert's name beside Evelyn Carter's. The same word staring back at me from the wall. My breath became shallow. I saw his name today, I said slowly. At the courthouse. Claire's eyes snapped toward mine. What do you mean you saw his name? I swallowed hard, forcing the words out. There was a public filing board. Guardianship petitions. His name was listed there, more than once. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything we had spoken so far. That's not coincidence, Claire said softly. Her voice carried a certainty that made my chest tighten even further. I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing through memories that now felt different under this new light. One moment returned with uncomfortable clarity. We had been sitting in a restaurant weeks earlier, candles flickering softly between us. I remembered asking him about his past work, curious about the stories he sometimes mentioned in passing. Robert had smiled proudly that night. I helped an older woman manage her finances, he had said. She didn't have anyone responsible in her life. At the time, I had admired him for it, thought it showed kindness, stability, responsibility. But now, that same memory twisted into something darker. What exactly did you do for her? I had asked that night. He leaned back slightly, looking satisfied. Just stepped in where help was needed, he said. Sometimes people need guidance, someone willing to make tough decisions for them. The way he said it, confident, certain, now felt unsettling. Back in the present. I rubbed my temples slowly, trying to ease the pressure building behind my eyes. We need someone else to look at this, Claire said firmly. Someone who understands this language better than we do. She reached for her phone and began dialing before I could answer. Who are you calling? I asked. Our attorney, she said. The one who handled your estate paperwork after Dad passed. Hearing her mention my late husband stirred something deep inside me, a quiet reminder of the careful planning we had done years ago. Back then, everything had felt structured, secure. Now, everything felt uncertain. Claire placed the call on speaker. After 2 rings, a familiar voice answered. Hello, Mr. Bennett. It's Claire Lawson, she said calmly. I need you to review a prenup document immediately. There was a pause on the other end. Is everything all right? He asked. Claire glanced at me before answering. Not exactly. She summarized the situation quickly, reading portions of the clause aloud. I watched her face carefully as she spoke, noticing how her voice remained steady even while my hands trembled slightly in my lap. When she finished, silence filled the line. Longer than comfortable. Then Mr. Bennett spoke again, his tone more serious than before. Do not sign anything yet. The firmness in his voice made my heart skip. Has Robert ever suggested medical evaluations? He asked. The question landed like a sudden blow. Medical evaluations. A memory surfaced immediately, sharp and unwelcome. Robert standing beside me in the kitchen weeks earlier, his voice calm and reassuring. You should schedule a routine wellness exam, he had said, just to make sure everything stays on track. At the time, it had sounded thoughtful, caring. Now, it sounded calculated. I felt my stomach twist. Yes, I whispered. He mentioned that recently. Mr. Bennett exhaled slowly. Be cautious, he said. If someone is preparing legal authority under vague incapacity terms, medical documentation can become part of that process. My fingers curled tightly around the edge of the table. Not just losing money, losing control. That was the fear now forming clearly in my mind. After the call ended, Claire gathered the papers carefully into a neat stack. We didn't speak for several minutes. The kitchen clock ticked steadily against the wall, marking each passing second like a reminder that time mattered now. Later that night, after Claire left, the house fell into a silence that felt deeper than usual. The prenup papers remained spread across the table, illuminated by the soft overhead light. I sat there alone, staring at Robert's signature at the bottom of the page. His name, written with confident strokes, once felt reassuring. Now, it felt threatening. Memories flickered through my mind like fragments of another life. Robert holding my hand, promising stability, speaking about building a future together. Warm memories now clashed with cold legal language. Had I been chosen? Or targeted? The question lingered in the quiet room. My phone buzzed suddenly, breaking the silence. I picked it up, my pulse quickening. Claire's name appeared on the screen. "Mom?" she said quickly when I answered. I kept digging. My throat tightened. "What did you find?" Her voice lowered slightly. Cautious. I found more information about Evelyn Carter. I sat up straighter, my grip tightening around the phone. She transferred financial authority to someone. Claire continued. Not long before she relocated. Transferred authority. The phrase echoed through my mind like a warning bell. But that's not the worst part, Claire added. My heart pounded harder. What else? I whispered. There was a pause before she spoke again. Robert has been listed as legal caregiver for more than one woman. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything before it. Not coincidence. Not misunderstanding. A pattern. And for the first time since this began, fear shifted into something sharper. Something colder. Something dangerously close to anger. I sat in my living room the next morning staring at my phone, rereading Claire's message over and over as if the words might change if I looked long enough. I found his parents' real address. The message sat on the screen like something alive. I read the address again slowly, tracing the street name with my finger. It wasn't in Europe. It wasn't even across the country. It was 15 minutes from my house. A cold, hollow feeling formed in the center of my chest. Robert had told me his parents lived overseas. He had described small European streets, quiet markets, old stone buildings. He spoke about them with such detail that I had never questioned the story. Now, staring at the address glowing on my phone, I realized how easily I had believed him. Why lie about something so basic? I grabbed my purse and keys before I could talk myself out of it. If I waited, doubt would grow heavier. If I hesitated, fear would take control. The drive across town felt different than any drive I had taken before. Every red light seemed longer, every turn sharper. I followed Claire's directions carefully, watching as the scenery changed from familiar neighborhoods to streets I rarely visited. The houses grew older, smaller, paint peeled from wooden siding. Chain-link fences replaced neat hedges. The sidewalks cracked in uneven patterns, worn from years of use. This wasn't the elegant retirement life Robert had described. This was modest housing, practical, worn, lived in. I slowed as the building came into view. Senior housing. The sign stood in faded lettering near the entrance, surrounded by a narrow strip of grass that struggled to stay green. Several elderly residents sat outside on folding chairs, their faces turned toward the sun. My throat tightened. Why hide this? Why invent an entirely different life for them? I parked slowly and sat there for a moment, my hands resting on the steering wheel. My heart pounded steadily, louder than the quiet hum of nearby traffic. This wasn't just confusion anymore. This was deception. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance, my footsteps heavier than usual. The hallway inside smelled faintly of disinfectant and old carpeting. A bulletin board lined one wall, covered in community notices and handwritten reminders. I checked the apartment number again, then knocked. The door opened almost instantly. Too instantly. An elderly man stood in the doorway, tall despite his age, his posture steady. His gray hair was neatly combed back, and his eyes, sharp and alert, locked onto mine immediately. Not surprised. Not confused. Expecting, "You're Maggie, aren't you?" he asked quietly. The sound of my name in his voice sent a chill through me. "Yes," I answered cautiously. "I'm Robert's fiancé?" The word fiancé felt strange now, heavy and uncertain. He studied my face for a long second before stepping aside. "You should come in," he said. Inside. The apartment was small but tidy. A worn couch sat against one wall. A small table held neatly stacked magazines. Everything felt simple, organized, cared for despite limited means. Then I saw her. An elderly woman sat on the couch, her hands folded tightly in her lap. When her eyes met mine, something inside her seemed to break. Fear. Not confusion. Not curiosity. Fear. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the cushion. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered. The warning in her voice struck me harder than any accusation could have. I didn't mean to intrude," I said carefully. "I just wanted to deliver a wedding invitation." The man closed the door behind me slowly, his hand lingering on the knob as if making sure no one else could hear. "Robert told you we were overseas." "Didn't he?" he asked. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. My silence confirmed everything. The woman on the couch lowered her head slightly, her shoulders shaking as quiet tears slipped down her cheeks. "You are not the first woman," she whispered. The words hit me like a physical blow. "Not the first." Time slowed inside the room. "How many?" I asked softly, my voice barely steady. The man sighed deeply, lowering himself into a chair across from me. "More than there should have been," he said. The weight of regret in his voice filled the room. Years of silence. Years of worry. Years of helpless watching. He told us he was helping people. The man continued. Said he was protecting vulnerable women who needed assistance managing their affairs. His hands folded tightly together, knuckles pale. At first, we believed him. The woman on the couch wiped her tears with trembling fingers. "But things changed," she said quietly. I sat there, my body still but my thoughts racing. The air felt heavy, thick with tension that had been building for years before I ever walked into this room. "What happened?" I asked. The man leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering. "There was a lawsuit once," he said. A woman claimed he had taken control of her finances unfairly. Said she never understood what she signed. The words echoed through my mind. Taken control. Never understood. But the case disappeared, he continued. Settled quietly. No public outcome. The woman shook her head slowly. "We tried to stop him," she whispered. "But he stopped speaking to us instead." Silence settled again, thick and suffocating. I looked between them, my chest tightening with every breath. All those years of distance. Not because of pride. Because of fear. The man stood slowly and walked toward a small cabinet near the wall. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He opened the cabinet carefully and reached inside. Then he pulled out an envelope. Thick, worn, handled many times. The edges had yellowed with age, and the paper inside shifted heavily as he carried it toward me. "We kept these," he said quietly, "in case someone else came." The meaning behind his words struck me immediately. Someone else? Another woman? Another fiancé? Another victim? My fingers trembled slightly as I reached for the envelope. It felt heavier than expected, thick with years of hidden truth. I opened it slowly. Inside were copies of legal filings, each page neatly organized, each name printed in dark ink. The first name meant nothing to me. The second, unfamiliar. The third, equally distant. Then my eyes landed on a pattern. Repeated phrases. Repeated structures. Repeated authority language. I turned another page. And another. Each one told the same story in different names. Guardianship. Financial authority. Temporary control. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't coincidence. This was method. Then one detail made my stomach tighten sharply. The wording, exact phrasing, the same language from my prenup, word for word identical. My chest tightened until breathing felt difficult. He hadn't written that document just for me. He had used it before. I lowered the papers slowly, my hands trembling. The man watched me carefully, his eyes filled with quiet urgency. "He knows you're asking questions," he said. The words struck deeper than anything else that day. My pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" I asked. His expression darkened slightly. "Once Robert realizes you no longer trust him," he said slowly, his voice heavy with warning, "he moves faster." The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt dangerous. And for the first time since this nightmare began, fear replaced uncertainty completely. I sat at the small kitchen table in Robert's parents' apartment, the thick envelope resting in front of me like something alive. The paper felt heavier than it should have, as if years of silence had settled into its weight. Robert's mother watched me from across the table, her hands trembling slightly in her lap, her eyes filled with a quiet fear that made my chest tighten. For a moment, I couldn't move. Once I opened it, there would be no turning back. I slid my fingers under the flap and pulled the first document free. The paper crackled softly, worn at the edges from years of handling. My eyes scanned the top line slowly. A woman's name stared back at me. Not Evelyn Carter. Someone else? Guardianship petition, filed by Robert Hale. The words blurred for a second before coming back into focus. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to keep reading. She trusted him, Robert's father said quietly. His voice carried the weight of years spent watching something unfold without being able to stop it. And she lost nearly everything. My fingers tightened around the paper. Nearly everything. The phrase lingered in my mind as I pulled out the next document. Another woman. Different year. Different name. Same legal structure. My stomach twisted as I recognized the language printed across the page. The formatting looked eerily familiar, the same spacing, the same wording style, the same cold legal tone I had seen in my own prenup. "This isn't coincidence," I whispered. Robert's mother shook her head slowly, her expression filled with sorrow. "They all believed he was helping them," she said. "That he cared." The words stung more than I expected. I flipped through more pages, faster now, my heart pounding with every new name that appeared. Each case followed the same pattern. Engagement. Legal paperwork. Guardianship request. Again. And again. And again. Something inside me shifted. Fear began to harden into anger. A slow, steady anger that replaced the trembling uncertainty I had carried since that first moment in the courthouse. "Why didn't anyone stop him?" I asked, my voice sharper than before. Robert's father exhaled slowly, his shoulders sinking under invisible weight. "We tried," he said. "More than once." I paused, staring at him. "There was always a reason," he continued. "A justification. A story about helping someone who couldn't manage their affairs alone." I lowered my eyes to the papers again, flipping to another page. That was when I saw it. A phrase so familiar that my breath caught in my throat. Temporary authority during periods of incapacity. The exact wording from my prenup. Word for word identical. My chest tightened sharply. He hadn't written that document just for me. He had reused it. Again and again. My hands trembled slightly as I set the paper down. "He planned this," I whispered. Robert's mother nodded, her voice barely audible. "Yes." Silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. Then Robert's father leaned forward, his voice lowering. "You need to understand something," he said carefully. I looked up at him. "Once he suspects you're questioning him," he continued, "he moves faster." A cold sensation slid down my spine. "Faster how?" I asked. He hesitated for only a second. "Marriage. Legal control. Medical authority. Medical authority." The words struck deep, echoing through my memory. Robert standing in my kitchen weeks earlier. "You should schedule a routine wellness evaluation," he had said casually, "just to stay ahead of any health concerns." At the time, it sounded thoughtful. Now, It sounded strategic. Before I could respond, my purse buzzed beside me. The vibration startled me. I reached for it slowly, my heart pounding harder with each second. Robert's name flashed across the screen. My breath caught. The phone buzzed again and again. Multiple calls in quick succession. My hands felt colder than before. How does he know where you are? Robert's mother whispered. I shook my head slowly. I don't know. The phone stopped vibrating. Silence settled into the room. Then a soft chime sounded. A message appeared on the screen. Where are you? We need to talk. The words looked simple. Normal. But something about them felt heavy. Demanding. Not curious. Not concerned. Controlling. Another message followed before I could respond. I already scheduled your medical appointment. My stomach tightened sharply. Medical appointment. Not asked. Scheduled. My mind raced, connecting every warning I had heard since this nightmare began. Guardianship filings, prenup clauses, legal authority language. This wasn't about concern. It was about control. I locked the screen slowly and set the phone down on the table. My hands trembled slightly, but the fear that once ruled my thoughts was beginning to shift into something steadier, something colder. If I panicked now, he would win. If I reacted emotionally, he would move faster. I took a slow breath, forcing my thoughts into order. What do I do next? I asked quietly. Robert's father met my gaze, his expression steady. You protect yourself, he said. His voice carried quiet authority. You contact a lawyer immediately. He stood slowly and walked to the counter, reaching for a small notepad. His movements were deliberate, careful, as if every action mattered. Miniature scratches filled the paper as he wrote a name and number. This man helped us years ago, he said, tearing the paper free and sliding it across the table toward me. A good attorney. Careful, thorough. I picked up the slip of paper, staring at the handwritten name. Hope flickered faintly beneath the fear. For the first time since this began, I wasn't completely alone. My phone buzzed again. The sudden vibration made my pulse spike. I glanced at the screen. Another message from Robert. I'm coming over tonight. Not a question, a statement. My chest tightened as realization settled into place. He wasn't waiting. He wasn't slowing down. He was moving. And now, so was I. I drove home with my hands locked tight around the steering wheel. Robert's message echoing through my mind with every mile. I'm coming over tonight. Not asking. Not checking if I was home. Just announcing it like he already owned the space I lived in. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the late evening sky had darkened into deep shades of blue and gray. The porch light flickered on automatically as I stepped out of the car, casting long shadows across the front steps. My house had always been my refuge, the one place where I felt completely in control. Tonight, it felt different, exposed. I locked the front door behind me carefully, sliding the deadbolt into place with slow, deliberate movement. The sound echoed louder than usual in the quiet hallway. Moments later, headlights swept across the front window. Claire. Relief washed through me when she stepped inside, her expression focused and serious. I came as fast as I could, she said, setting her bag down on the kitchen counter. I nodded, grateful for her presence. He says he's coming over tonight, I told her quietly. Claire didn't react with panic. Instead, she inhaled slowly, steadying herself the way she always did when preparing for difficult situations. Then we need to be smarter than he is, she said. Her voice carried calm authority, the kind that steadied my nerves. You can't let him know you suspect anything, she continued. Not yet. The words felt strange. Pretend everything is normal. Pretend trust still exists. But deep down, I knew she was right. If he realizes you're onto him, Claire added, he'll move faster. Faster. The word sent a chill through me. We sat together at the kitchen table, whispering carefully as we outlined what little control we still had. Claire explained how staying calm would buy time to gather more proof. Time to strengthen legal protection. You act normal, she said. Friendly. Cooperative. The idea twisted in my chest. Trusting him now felt like stepping into a trap on purpose. But survival sometimes meant walking carefully through danger. Night fell slowly around us. The sky outside darkened until the windows reflected our own nervous faces back at us. The quiet inside the house grew heavier with each passing minute. Then the doorbell rang. Short. Sharp. The sound sliced through the silence like a blade. I froze where I stood, my breath catching in my throat. Claire moved quickly, stepping into the hallway where Robert couldn't see her from the door. She gave me a small nod before disappearing from sight. My heart pounded harder as I walked toward the front door. Each step felt heavier than the last. I opened it slowly. Robert stood on the porch, dressed neatly as always, his posture straight, his expression calm. The familiar smile rested perfectly on his face, practiced and polished. But his eyes didn't match the smile. They looked sharp, searching, studying me. You look beautiful tonight, he said softly as he leaned forward to kiss my cheek. The touch felt colder than it ever had before. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. A small movement, but deliberate. Possessive. Where were you today? He asked casually. His tone sounded gentle, but the question carried weight. I ran errands, I answered calmly, forcing my voice to remain steady. Stopped by church. Robert didn't respond immediately. Instead, he watched me. Closely. Too closely. He walked slowly across the living room, his gaze sweeping over everything, the furniture, the walls, the quiet corners of the house. Studying, evaluating. I felt like I was being measured, like prey beneath careful observation. Then he sat down, resting his hands neatly on his knees. I scheduled your wellness evaluation, he said suddenly. The words struck without warning, not asked. Declared. My stomach tightened sharply. What do you mean? I asked, forcing calm into my voice. Just routine, he said smoothly. You should stay ahead of any health concerns. His tone sounded caring, reassuring. But underneath, I heard something else. Control. I didn't realize we agreed to that, I said carefully. For the first time, his smile disappeared. Suddenly, like a mask slipping off. His jaw tightened slightly, the muscles along his face becoming rigid. You worry too much, he replied. The softness in his voice was gone, replaced with something sharper, dismissive, cold. Fear crept back into my chest, sharper now than before. This was the first time I saw the anger beneath his charm. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay steady. Then I asked the question that had been sitting at the edge of my thoughts. Have you ever helped someone with guardianship before? The reaction was immediate, small, but unmistakable. Robert froze for half a second. His eyes narrowed slightly, and his posture stiffened before he leaned back in his chair. Why would you ask that? He said slowly. My pulse surged. Danger hovered in the air between us. I forced a small smile. Pretending curiosity, I saw an article about elder care earlier, I said lightly. It made me curious about how those things work. Silence filled the room. Robert studied my face carefully, searching for something, doubt, suspicion, weakness. Then his shoulders relaxed slightly. Not fully, but enough. You don't need to worry about that, he said. That's complicated legal territory. His voice softened again, but the tension beneath it remained. Relief washed through me. Thin and fragile. He didn't believe me completely, but he didn't push further. After a few more minutes of strained conversation, Robert stood and moved toward the door. He paused with his hand resting on the doorknob, then turned back toward me. You need to trust me, he said quietly. The words sounded less like reassurance and more like instruction, a command disguised as care. His hand lingered on the knob before he finally opened the door and stepped outside. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Silence rushed back into the house. A few seconds later, Claire stepped out from the hallway, her expression tight with tension. "I recorded everything," she whispered. My heart skipped. She pulled out her phone and tapped the screen. Robert's voice filled the room, sharp. Controlled, cold. Hearing it replayed stripped away every illusion that had once protected me. And as the recording ended, a terrifying realization settled into my chest. He wasn't worried about losing me. He was worried about losing control. The next evening, I refused to cancel the rehearsal dinner. Robert believed everything was moving forward exactly as he planned. That the wedding was still on track. That I remained exactly where he expected me to be, trusting, compliant, obedient. But that night wasn't about celebration. It was about truth. Claire arrived at my house hours earlier, carrying a leather folder filled with carefully organized documents. Behind her calm expression, I could see the same quiet determination building inside me. "Everything is ready," she said softly, placing the folder on the kitchen counter. Our attorney had prepared copies of every filing Robert's parents had saved. Guardianship petitions, legal complaints, medical scheduling confirmations. Each page carefully labeled and dated. Evidence, not suspicion. Truth. I picked up the folder and held it against my chest for a moment, feeling its weight. This was the armor I would carry into battle. By the time we arrived at the restaurant, the private dining room was already filling with familiar faces. Friends from church laughed easily, unaware of the storm waiting just beneath the surface. Warm lights glowed above polished tables. Glasses clinked softly. Plates were passed from hand to hand as if nothing in the world could possibly go wrong. Everyone believed this was a celebration. Only I knew it was a confrontation. Robert entered moments later, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, confidence radiating from every step he took. He smiled easily as he greeted guests, shaking hands and exchanging jokes like a man completely in control of his world. When he reached me, he leaned in and kissed my cheek. "You look beautiful tonight," he whispered. His hand settled at my waist, lingering slightly longer than usual. Possessive, as if I already belonged to him. My stomach tightened, but my expression remained calm. Dinner moved forward with polite conversation and soft laughter. I nodded at the right moments, smiled when expected, answered questions without revealing the storm growing inside my chest. Then I saw Claire across the table. She met my gaze and gave the smallest nod. The signal. My pulse steadied. This was the moment. I pushed my chair back slowly and stood. The room quieted just slightly as conversations paused. Several people turned toward me with curious smiles. Robert looked up. His expression relaxed. "Before we celebrate," I said calmly. My voice steady despite the pounding in my chest. "There's something important I need to share." Robert froze, only for half a second. But I saw it. That tiny crack in his confidence. I reached into my purse and placed the folder onto the center of the table. The sound of paper touching polished wood echoed louder than expected. People leaned forward, confusion spreading across their faces. Robert's smile stiffened. "What is this?" he asked quietly. I opened the folder and began laying out copies of the documents one by one, spreading them across the table so everyone could see. "These," I said carefully, "are legal petitions filed under Robert's name." A murmur moved through the room. Soft whispers, uneasy glances. Robert remained silent, but tension tightened across his shoulders. "These documents involve guardianship cases," I continued. "Multiple women, multiple financial controls." The room grew quieter with every word. Then the door behind us opened. Slowly, heads turned. Robert turned too, sharply this time. His parents stepped inside. His father walked steadily, his posture firm despite his age. His mother followed beside him, her expression nervous but determined. Shock rippled through the room. Robert's face changed instantly. Anger flashed across his eyes. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. His father ignored the question. "We came because truth matters," he said calmly. Silence pressed down over the room. Then another figure appeared in the doorway. A woman stepped inside slowly, thin, pale, hesitant. Recognition struck me instantly. Evelyn Carter. Gasps filled the room as whispers spread like wildfire. She disappeared months ago, someone murmured. Robert's posture stiffened completely. His hands curled into tight fists at his sides. Evelyn walked forward carefully, her voice soft but steady. "He promised to protect me," she said quietly. "Told me he would help manage my finances." Her eyes moved across the room before settling on Robert. "Instead, he took everything." The words landed like thunder. Robert stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly across the floor. "This is nonsense," he snapped. The charm he once wore so easily vanished completely. His voice rose with frustration. "This is manipulation," he continued. "They're twisting facts." Guests exchanged nervous glances. Some leaned away from him. Others stared at the documents scattered across the table. The room no longer belonged to him. It belonged to truth. I remained standing, steady and calm despite the pounding of my heart. "I will not marry you," I said clearly. The silence that followed felt endless, heavy. "Final?" Robert stared at me, shock flickering across his face before hardening into anger. At that moment, our attorney stepped forward from the far side of the room. "These filings are currently under review," he announced calmly. "There are multiple cases connected to Mr. Hale's name." Robert's confidence crumbled further. His breathing grew faster. Then the door opened once more. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside. The sound of their boots against the floor silenced the room completely. No laughter, no whispers, only stillness. Robert turned slowly toward them, disbelief spreading across his face. For the first time since I had known him, he looked uncertain, powerless. And in that moment, he finally understood. The control he fought so hard to keep was already slipping away. The room went completely silent the moment the officers stepped inside. Even the faint clinking of glasses stopped. Conversations died mid-sentence. The warm laughter that had filled the space only minutes earlier disappeared like smoke. Robert stood frozen near the center of the room, his shoulders stiff. His expression caught somewhere between anger and disbelief. One officer approached calmly, speaking in a steady, professional tone that carried across the quiet space. "Mr. Hale, we need to speak with you." Robert opened his mouth as if to argue, but his voice came out weaker than I had ever heard before. "This is ridiculous," he said, glancing toward the guests. "You're all making a mistake." No one responded. No one defended him. For the first time since I had known him, the room no longer belonged to his charm or his confidence. It belonged to truth. He turned toward me once more, his eyes sharp, filled not with affection, but anger. The same anger I had glimpsed the night before, now fully exposed. I met his gaze without flinching, not afraid. Not anymore. The officers gently guided him aside, speaking quietly as they began asking questions. Papers shifted across the table as our attorney moved closer, calmly explaining the documentation that had been gathered. But I didn't stay to watch. I stepped away from the table, my legs trembling slightly as I walked toward the exit. Claire followed beside me, her presence steady and reassuring. The cool night air hit my face the moment I stepped outside. I inhaled deeply, filling my lungs with fresh air that felt cleaner than anything I had breathed in days. Behind me, the door closed softly. I didn't look back. Not once. My hands trembled slightly as we walked toward the car. But it wasn't fear shaking through me. It was release. Something heavy, something that had been tightening around my life piece by piece, had finally loosened its grip. The days that followed felt both exhausting and strangely peaceful. Meetings with our attorney became part of my routine. Long hours were spent reviewing documents, signing protective filings, and securing everything that Robert had once positioned himself to control. Each signature felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Bank accounts were reviewed, property titles secured, legal safeguards placed into motion. More names surfaced during the investigation, women who had once trusted him, just as I had. Their stories followed the same pattern, the same promises, the same manipulation. But this time, the pattern had been exposed. This time, someone had stopped it. Late one evening, Claire sat across from me at the kitchen table, 2 mugs of tea resting between us. The house felt quiet again, but this time, the quiet felt safe instead of threatening. She reached across the table and took my hand gently. "You trusted your instincts," she said softly. Tears filled my eyes before I realized they were coming. Not loud, dramatic tears, just quiet ones that slipped down without resistance. I almost didn't. I admitted. Claire squeezed my hand gently. "But you did," she replied. Her voice carried quiet pride. In that moment, I realized how close I had come to losing everything, not just money or property, but independence, identity, control over my own life, strength. I realized didn't always come from standing alone. Sometimes it came from allowing others to stand beside you. The first Sunday I returned to church felt harder than I expected. My hands trembled slightly as I pushed open the heavy wooden doors, unsure of what I would face inside. Conversations paused when I stepped into the room. For a brief moment, uncertainty settled into my chest. Then Linda approached. She didn't hesitate. She didn't ask questions. She simply wrapped her arms around me in a warm, steady embrace. "We're proud of you," she whispered. The words settled deep inside me, filling the space where fear had once lived. Public shame, the fear I had carried silently, faded in the warmth of community support. Days later, a letter arrived in my mailbox. The return address caught my attention immediately. Evelyn Carter. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the envelope. Inside, her handwriting flowed across the page, steady, careful, sincere. She thanked me, not just for speaking up, but for refusing to stay silent. "You gave me courage," she wrote. "More than you know." The words blurred slightly as emotion filled my chest. At the bottom of the letter, one sentence stood out clearly. "You saved more than yourself." I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside my drawer, knowing I would read it again whenever doubt tried to creep back into my thoughts. That evening, I sat alone on my porch, watching the sun dip slowly below the horizon. The sky shifted through shades of gold and orange, fading into quiet blue. Peace settled gently around me. For the first time in weeks, my mind felt still. I thought back to that first moment standing outside the courthouse, staring at a building that didn't belong in the story I believed. The smallest warning sign. The moment that changed everything. Sometimes the quietest doubts are the ones we should listen to most. Sometimes the smallest hesitation becomes the strongest protection. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the engagement ring. The diamond caught the fading sunlight, sending tiny reflections across my palm. For a moment, I simply stared at it. Not with sadness, not with regret, with clarity. Carefully, I placed the ring into a small jewelry box beside me and closed the lid with a firm, final click. That chapter was finished, and I was still standing. Weeks passed, and slowly, life settled into a new rhythm. I updated my legal documents, met with financial advisors, reviewed plans that once felt distant but now felt necessary. For the first time in months, I felt fully in control of my own future again. Stronger, wiser, more aware. And if there's one thing this experience taught me, it's this: never ignore the voice inside you when something doesn't feel right. If you've ever found yourself doubting your instincts, wondering if you were overthinking, telling yourself everything would be fine because you wanted it to be, you're not alone. Many of us have been there. Many of us have trusted when we should have paused. So, if this story reminds you of something you've lived through, or a moment when your instincts tried to warn you, I hope you'll share it. Write it in the comments. Your story might help someone else recognize the warning signs before it's too late. And if stories like this, stories about strength, survival, and reclaiming control, speak to you, then stay with us. There are more stories worth hearing, more lessons worth learning. And sometimes, hearing the right story at the right moment can change everything.